I taught this for 11 years. I stood at the front of a lecture hall in Durham and I told students, year after year, about the documentary hypothesis. I explained the four sources. I named them J, E, D, P. I dated them, traced them, showed the seams where they were stitched together. And then, twice a week, I went to evensong at St. Peter Mancroft and sang hymns to the God of Moses as if none of it were true. I don't know what I thought I was doing. Compartmentalizing, I suppose. The scholar and the believer in separate rooms, each pretending the other didn't exist. That lasted a long time, longer than it should have. But there was one morning, not a dramatic morning, not a morning I'd have circled on a calendar, when I was reading Deuteronomy 34, the final chapter, Moses' death, and something I had read dozens of times, something I had literally quoted to students, finally landed differently. The text says, "And Moses died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is." Third person, past tense. The author reporting the burial of Moses as a historical event from a vantage point after Moses is dead and buried and forgotten. Moses wrote that. According to the tradition I was professionally obligated to respect, Moses wrote his own obituary. Moses described his own burial. Moses noted that to this day, nobody knows where Moses is buried. I put the page down. I made tea. I stood in my kitchen in Norwich for what felt like a very long time. And I thought, this is not a small problem. This is not an editorial quirk. This is the text itself, telling you it wasn't written by Moses. In the last paragraph of the last book Moses supposedly wrote. Spinoza said this in 1670. In print, at the cost of excommunication, at the cost of his name in his own community for the rest of his life. He pointed at Deuteronomy 34 and he said, "Whoever wrote this was not present at Sinai. He couldn't have been. He was writing about Moses the way you write about someone who has been dead for a very long time." I found that argument in a secondhand bookshop in Durham during my doctorate. Spine cracked, margins annotated in someone else's hand. I bought it for 60 pence. I read the relevant chapter on the bus back to college, and I missed my stop by 4 stations. That was 20 years before I could no longer sit at evensong without the words feeling hollow. If you're the kind of person who doesn't let a question go until you've followed it all the way down, this channel exists for exactly that. The subscribe button tells the algorithm you want more of this kind of conversation. I have a great many more questions I haven't been able to put down. Now, let me back up. Because the story I just told you, Moses writing his own death, is only the smallest crack in the surface. The question I actually want to spend this evening on is much larger and much stranger, and in the end, far more impressive than the version you were probably taught. The question is, if Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, who did? When? And why did they write what they wrote the way they wrote it? The answers changed everything I thought I understood about the origins of Western religion. Not because they made the Bible a fraud, because they made it something more astonishing than Revelation ever could have been. I want to start where the problem starts, not in the scholarship, in the history. In 587 BCE, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem. They pulled down the walls. They burnt the temple, Solomon's temple, the physical house of Yahweh, the single place where, according to Deuteronomy, God was permitted to be properly worshipped. They took the king captive. They took the priests, the scribes, the nobles, the craftsmen. They marched them 600 miles east to Babylon and they left them there. Think about what that meant. Not strategically, theologically, these people's entire religious framework, their entire understanding of who God was, how God worked, what the relationship between God and Israel meant, was built around specific geography, the temple in Jerusalem, the land of Canaan, the covenant God had made with this people in this place. Their God was not a universal God. He was, in the language of the earlier texts, the God who had led them out of Egypt, the God who had given them this specific land, the God who dwelt in this specific building. And now the building was ash. The land was occupied. The king was in chains. So what happens to a God who is defined by a geography that no longer exists? I sat with that question for months before I understood what the exilic priests actually did. And when I understood it, really understood it, I stopped being angry about what had been hidden from me. I started being astonished at what had been achieved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before you can understand the exile, you have to understand what Israelite religion actually looked like before 587. And that is where almost everything you were taught in church was simply wrong. Israelite religion before the Babylonian exile was not monotheism. I'll say that again, because it matters. The Israelites did not believe in one God. Not in Moses' time. Not in David's time. Not even in practice in most of Solomon's time. What they practiced was something scholars call monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God, without denying that other gods exist. Yahweh was their God. He was the most powerful God, the God of their covenant, the God who had given them the land. But there were other gods, and those gods were real and were worshipped sometimes by Israelites. The archaeological evidence for this is not ambiguous. It is overwhelming. Household figurines of Asherah, a goddess, the consort of El in the older Canaanite pantheon, have been found throughout Israelite sites from the pre-exilic period, in houses, in temples, in royal strata. An inscription from Kuntilat Ajrud, a site in the Sinai desert from the 8th century BCE, refers to Yahweh and his Asherah, Yahweh with a female companion. This is not fringe archaeology. This is mainstream. This is what the ground yields when you dig. Richard Elliott Friedman, in Who Wrote the Bible, published in 1987, made this accessible for a general audience in a way it hadn't been before. He traced the 4 source documents, JEDP, and showed that each one reflects a different theological community, a different historical moment, a different political pressure. The strictest monotheism, the one that says, "I am the Lord, and there is no other," belongs entirely to the latest layer, the priestly source, the editors who did their work in Babylon. The older sources still have the old world bleeding through. Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, one of the oldest poems in the entire Hebrew Bible, possibly pre-monarchic, asks, "Who among the gods is like you, Yahweh?" Not, "There are no other gods." Among the gods, which is greatest? That is the theology of a people who are still polytheists in practice, monolatrous at best, and it's in the Bible. It made it through the editorial process. You can read it this evening. I want to stop there for a moment because I nearly missed this. I almost walked past it without seeing it, and I've been a professional reader of these texts for more than 30 years. Excuse that. Let me reformulate. What I mean is, the seams are in the text. Spinoza saw them in 1670. Medieval Jewish scholars, Ibn Ezra in the 12th century, had noticed specific problems centuries before that. The doubt about Mosaic authorship is not a modern secular invention imported to undermine faith. It is native to the text itself. The text raises these questions in its own words. You just have to be willing to look. And that is precisely what the priestly editors in Babylon were counting on their audience not doing. Here is what I think happened in Babylon. This is me speculating. Educated speculation grounded in the evidence, but speculation nonetheless. I want to be honest about that. A group of priests and scribes, possibly a small group, 6 to 8 people, maybe fewer, found themselves in exile with a catastrophic problem. Their entire theological framework required geography that no longer existed. If Yahweh was the God of the temple in Jerusalem and the temple was gone, then either Yahweh was defeated or Yahweh was something else. A defeated God was unacceptable. So Yahweh had to become something else. What they did, what I can only describe as an act of collective intellectual genius under catastrophic pressure, was to rewrite the foundational documents of their tradition in a way that retroactively universalized God. They compiled the earlier source documents. They added their own layer, the priestly source, P, and that layer is unmistakable. Genesis 1, the elegant, structured, liturgical creation narrative. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is P. That is the exilic priests. That is Babylon, 500 BCE, not Sinai, 1200 BCE. And in that narrative, God doesn't create the land of Canaan. God creates the cosmos. He isn't tied to a place. He isn't contained in a building. He is before geography, before territory, before politics. He simply is. Everywhere, always, regardless of whether the temple stands. The exile, in their retelling, was not a defeat. It was a test. The loss of the land was not evidence that God had failed. It was evidence that Israel had failed God, and that God, being universal and beyond geography, could still be worshipped in Babylon as fully as in Jerusalem. That is an extraordinary intellectual move. I don't say that lightly. As a theologian, as someone who spent his career watching ideas develop and mutate and adapt, the transformation of a local, territorial, monolatrous deity into the universal creator God of ethical monotheism, accomplished under conditions of total national catastrophe in a generation, that is one of the most impressive theological achievements in human history. I want to pause here, because somewhere around this point in the argument, people usually object. They say, isn't this just saying the whole thing was made up? That it was lies, propaganda, priestly manipulation? And I think that objection, while understandable, fundamentally misunderstands what was happening. The priestly editors were not fabricating fiction. They were transmitting a living tradition under existential threat. And they were doing what every major religious tradition does in crisis, reinterpreting the past to make it livable in the present. The raw material was not invented. The monolatrous worship of Yahweh was centuries old. The covenant tradition was centuries old. The memory of the Exodus was centuries old. What the exilic editors did was take that tradition, compile it, and universalize it, because a God without geographic boundaries was the only God who could survive the destruction of Jerusalem. That's not fabrication. That's theology under pressure, and it produced something genuinely new. The Deutero-Isaiah, the anonymous prophet writing in Babylon around 550 to 540 BCE, contains the oldest unambiguous written monotheism in the entire Bible. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. That was written by a captive, in a foreign city, by a man who had no temple, no land, no king, no institutional authority. And it is the statement that would, 2,500 years later, underpin the theology of half the planet. I find that almost unbearably moving. I was at a conference in Cambridge. This was perhaps 15 years ago, a few years before my retirement. Late evening, the wine long gone, A colleague who worked on ancient Near Eastern languages pulled out his laptop and showed me photographs of something called the Elephantine Papyri, a Jewish military colony stationed in Upper Egypt in the 5th century BCE, decades after the Babylonian exile was supposedly over, decades after the priestly editors had supposedly universalized monotheism, and these Jews, writing letters to each other about perfectly mundane matters, expenses, property disputes, were making financial contributions to Yahweh and to a goddess. Anat Yahu. The letters were real. They were physical documents now held in Berlin and London and Cairo. They had found them in the ground in the 19th century. I looked at my colleague across the table. He was waiting to see my reaction. What I felt was not what I expected to feel. I thought I would feel vindicated. Here was proof, physical proof, that the monotheism the priestly editors had decreed had not actually taken hold immediately. That ordinary Jews in the 5th century BCE were still worshiping alongside a goddess. That the official theological revolutions and the lived reality were separated by generations, if not centuries. Instead, I felt something closer to grief. For the people of Elephantine. For the gap between what the editors in Babylon decreed and what ordinary people in Egypt were actually doing in their devotional lives. And underneath that grief, something else, a kind of admiration, strange and complicated, for the ambition of the priestly project. They had looked at a shattered world and decided to build something that had never existed before, and they built it so well that most of the people who inherited it had no idea it had been built at all. That's the moment I want to come back to, because I think it's the heart of this. Before I do, I want to ask you something directly. If the research I do here, this particular kind of following a question until it refuses to let go, matters to you, there's a way to support it that goes beyond the algorithm. The Spinoza Archive Library, 5 volumes of the kind of textual analysis we do in this channel, available via the link in the description and in the pinned comment below. That's how this work continues. Not because of anything I get personally, because it funds the next question, and the one after that. Have a look when you have a moment. Now, let me tell you what I think the priestly editors actually understood that we in our condescending modernity tend to miss. They understood that a people without a narrative cannot survive. That identity, real, coherent, durable identity, requires a story about who you are, where you came from, what you're for, and why everything that happened to you, including the worst of it, happened within a framework of meaning rather than as pure random catastrophe. The Babylonian exile of 587 BCE was, by any measure, a catastrophe. A small nation obliterated, its capital burnt, its ruling class scattered, its sacred institutions destroyed. By the logic of ancient Near Eastern theology, this should have been the end of Yahwism. The strongest God wins. Marduk beat Yahweh. The Babylonian Empire was the empirical evidence, but the priestly editors refused that logic. They said the evidence is misread. This was not Marduk defeating Yahweh. This was Yahweh using Babylon as an instrument of judgment against an unfaithful Israel. And the proof, the evidence for this reinterpretation, was in the text they compiled and edited and added to and shaped over the course of the exile. This is what the documentary hypothesis actually reveals when you follow it through. Not a conspiracy, not a forgery. A community of scribes working under conditions of total institutional collapse, doing something humans have always done in extremis, building meaning out of catastrophe. J. Source, the Yahwist, wrote in the southern kingdom perhaps as early as the 10th or 9th century BCE, when the monarchy was at its height. God walks in the garden. God is concrete, personal, almost anthropomorphic. God smells Noah's sacrifice and is pleased. This is early Israelite theology, warm and intimate. Esource, the Elohist, wrote in the northern kingdom, a different community with different emphases. God speaks in dreams. God is slightly more distant. The northern prophetic tradition. D. Source, the Deuteronomist, wrote in the context of King Josiah's 7th century religious reform. Josiah found or had someone find a book of the law in the temple in 621 BCE. Scholars are reasonably confident that book was an early version of Deuteronomy, or most of it. Josiah used it as the basis for a centralization of worship. All sacrifice had to happen in Jerusalem. All other altars were demolished. Local shrines were destroyed. D is the ideological product of that centralization. It is demanding. It is conditional. Love Yahweh exclusively and you get the land. Forget Yahweh and you lose it. And then Babylon arrived and the land was lost. And D's theology looked for a moment like it explained everything. Israel had been unfaithful, and this was the consequence. But D still needed the land to return. D's God was still geographically anchored. P, the priestly source, is the one that breaks free. P doesn't need a land. P's God created the cosmos before there was a land. P's creation narrative has no geography. P's God instituted the Sabbath as the sign of the covenant, not circumcision of land ownership, but a pattern of time, portable, practicable anywhere on earth, in Babylon as easily as in Jerusalem. I think P is the most radical theological document in the entire Hebrew Bible. More radical than anything in the prophets. Because P was written by people who had lost everything. And instead of mourning what was lost, they reimagined what God was. Here is the thing I couldn't unsee after I finally understood it properly. The Bible tells itself as a story that begins at creation and moves forward through history. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, a seamless narrative of God's relationship with one people, narrated as if from the beginning. But the editors were writing from the end, not the beginning. They were in Babylon in 500 BCE, looking backwards, reaching into their oral traditions, their earlier documents, their fragmented archives, and constructing a narrative of origins that made sense of where they now were. They weren't telling the story of where they'd come from. They were building a story that explained how they could survive where they'd ended up. That's the inversion. That's what stopped me sleeping the night I finally saw it clearly. We read the Pentateuch as a story moving from past to present, but it was written from the present back into the past. The cosmological God of Genesis 1 was not the ancestral God of the earliest Israelites. He was the God they needed in Babylon. And they put him at the beginning of the story because if he was always there, if he had been the universal creator from before time, then his authority didn't depend on a temple or a land or a king. His authority predated all of those things. He could survive their loss. That is brilliant. I mean that with complete sincerity and not a trace of irony. That is a theological and literary achievement of the first order. And the most remarkable thing is that it worked. It worked so completely, so durably, so persuasively that the majority of people who have read those texts in the 2,500 years since have had no idea they were reading a document shaped in exile by a small group of priestly editors working under catastrophic pressure for explicitly pragmatic theological reasons. The seams are there. You can read them. Spinoza read them. Ibn Ezra had noticed some of them in the 12th century. The scholars who built the documentary hypothesis in the 19th and 20th centuries cataloged them systematically, and they're still there when you read the text this evening. Nowhere hidden, just not seen, because you have to be willing to look. Now, I want to come back to what I said at the beginning. I said, I taught this for 11 years. I stood at the front of a lecture hall and I explained the four sources: the exilic redaction, the universalization of Yahweh during the Babylonian captivity. And then I went to evensong. What I didn't say, what I wasn't ready to say, even to myself for a long time, was that I was angry. Not at the church, not at the tradition, at myself, because I had the information. I had had it since my doctorate. I knew that the creation narrative in Genesis 1 was written in Babylon in 500 BCE by priests who needed a portable, geographically unanchored God. I knew that the account of Moses' death was written by someone who was not Moses. I knew that the fierce, exclusive monotheism of Deutero-Isaiah was the product of exile, not Sinai, not revelation, not the burning bush. And I still went to evensong, twice a week, for 11 years after my doctorate. Not out of cowardice, I hope. I think it was something more complicated than that. Something like the inability to abandon a community of people I loved, even after the intellectual framework they built their worship around had collapsed for me. Something like grief. Something like loyalty to a version of the truth I had already stopped believing. The marriage ending came later. That was its own story. But the faith ending, that happened in Durham, on a bus, reading Spinoza, missing my stop by 4 stations. What I couldn't have told you then was whether losing the faith was a loss. I thought it was. For years, I was quite certain it was. I'm less certain now. Because what I received in exchange for that faith, not immediately, not as compensation, but over time as I kept reading and kept following the questions, was something that feels, if I'm honest, more valuable than what I lost. Not comfort. Comfort I lost and I don't have it back, but understanding. Real understanding of what these texts are, how they were made, why they were made, who made them, and under what conditions and for what purposes. The priestly editors in Babylon were not frauds. They were people in extremis doing what humans do in extremis, building something that could hold the weight of catastrophe. They built a God big enough to survive the end of everything they'd known. And the edifice they built has held for 2,500 years, across 3 continents, in 3 major world religions that are, in their most fundamental theological commitments, all the inheritance of those 6 or 8 scribes working in Babylon. In 500 BCE, with Ash where Jerusalem used to be. I find that genuinely moving. More moving, in some ways, than the alternative, than a God who simply appeared on a mountain and dictated the text to one man. That version requires no imagination, no courage, no ingenuity, no community, no terrible grief. The human version requires all of those things, and it produced something that outlasted every empire that ever threatened it. Here is what I want to leave you with. I began this evening saying I taught this for 11 years and spent those same years singing hymns to Moses' God. I called that compartmentalization. I've been thinking about that word since I started recording, and I think I was wrong. I don't think it was compartmentalization. I think it was 2 different kinds of knowing, each waiting for me to understand what the other one meant. The academic knowledge told me how the text was made. The devotional practice showed me what the text had done to people, what it still does, what it meant to every person in that church who had never read Spinoza and would have found the documentary hypothesis incomprehensible and devastating. The text works. Even knowing how it was made, it works. The priestly creation narrative is one of the most beautiful things ever written in any language. The 23rd Psalm, probably from the monarchy, centuries before the exile, still does something to language that I can't explain and can't replicate. The Deutero-Isaiah's declaration of universal monotheism, written by a captive in a foreign city with nothing left to lose, is one of the most audacious sentences in human literature. Knowing it was written by humans, knowing the specific historical pressures that shaped it, knowing which verses belong to P and which to J and which to D, none of that removes what the text does. It adds something. It adds respect. It adds the knowledge that this was made, and that the making of it cost something real, and that what was made has lasted. I walked away from faith. I don't regret that. I couldn't have stayed without dishonesty, and dishonesty in the end was the one thing the tradition I was walking away from had taught me to refuse. But I didn't walk away from the text. I've been reading it more carefully since I left the pew than I ever did when I was in it. That's either a contradiction or the point. I haven't decided which. If it's the point, then maybe the priestly editors in Babylon were right about something even more fundamental than monotheism. Maybe the thing that actually survives catastrophe isn't certainty. It's attention, the willingness to keep reading, to keep asking what the text is and who made it and why. Moses didn't write his own death. Someone else did. And whoever that someone was, that unnamed scribe in Babylon, writing in a language not entirely his own, in a city not his home, about a man dead for centuries, that person made something that I, 26 centuries later, in a house in Norwich, still cannot put down. I think that's enough for this evening. If this kind of conversation is useful to you, not just intellectually, but as a way of being honest about things that are genuinely difficult, the super thanks below is a direct way to tell me so. It means the next question gets the same time and attention this one got, and the one after that. And if you want to tell me where I'm wrong, I'd mean that seriously, not as a figure of speech. The comments are open. I've been thinking about this particular question for 20 years, and I'm quite sure I haven't seen all of it yet. If you have a piece I'm missing, or a line of evidence I haven't accounted for, or if you simply need to say that this was harder to hear than you expected, write it down. I read everything. The question I want to leave in the room is this. If you grew up being told that God revealed the law to Moses on Sinai, and you now know what we know, not that it's false, but that it's more complicated, more human, more costly, what do you do with that? Do you grieve what you lost? Do you admire what was built? Or is there a third option I haven't found yet? I haven't found it, but I'm still looking.
Before you go, think about what you just learned. Maybe it confirms what you already suspected. Maybe it challenges everything. Either way, sit with it. The truth needs time to settle. Stay curious.